Hey guys, what's up? I'm Jessie, your boondock ballistician. A couple of you guys have commented this on previous videos that a woman has no place on the range, no business shooting guns, and you know what? You're right. So for today's video, I'm gonna be where I belong, in the kitchen. Gonna teach you guys how you can make ballistic gel blocks at home with hopefully not too much of trouble. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and let's get started. This video will wind up being kind of like a pseudo two-part video. So for this one, I wanna teach you guys how you can make blocks at home with kind of minimal equipment. And then the second part is going to be kind of explaining the differences between the types of gel blocks on the market and how to actually assess a gel block with what at least I've always been taught to do. The first step when doing something like this is of course going to be deciding what percentage of a gel block you want and what dimensions you want to use. Commonly you see 10%, that's the FBI standard, with a 16 by 6 by 6 block. Nothing wrong with that. I'm very used to doing 20%. That's what I've always used for work. And that's going to be what I continue to use here, just because if I'm going through the effort of making it, might as well make it a little extra nice, right? Typically, I use the 18 by 8 by 8 blocks when I am testing for work, but the 16 by 6 will work just fine for what I plan on doing with these. Saves us some money on gelatin as well. I will try to put a list of all of the items that I used in the description just to help you guys out as we follow along. But once you decide your dimensions, it's time to make your mold. I had a bunch of Amazon boxes lying around. Thankfully made that easy. There is no one right way to make this mold. Just measure out your dimensions, duct tape, and fold. You're going to want to make sure that you have as much sealed as possible to reduce any risk of gel leaking out. I did 2 molds for this and I did them both separate ways. You can see here with the first one that I had taped down tarp on the inside on individual panels, whereas for the second blocks I made here, I just kind of laid the tarp on the inside, kind of like a blanket, I guess. The first method is gonna wind up creating a smoother gel block. The second method ideally should be easier to pull out of the mold and make it easier for that to be reusable, but it is going to wind up creating some, textures, waves on the outside of the gel block. Not a bad thing for the sake of testing and use case. It's just obviously not going to look as pretty. I wanted to try some different methods out and see what worked, but yeah, you guys might have better suggestions in the comments. I am used to molds and I am used to giant 10-gallon KitchenAids to help mix all of this, so we're figuring it out together. Once you get your mold set and your dimensions established, it's time to figure out your ratio of your mix. Like I said, I wanted to do 20%, which means 20% gelatin to 80% of water for whatever volume that you're going to do. For a 16 by 6 by 6 rectangle here, I'm going to wind up needing what I calculated out to as about 1.89 kilograms of gelatin and about 1.981, so just shy of 2 gallons of water. This was a rough estimate here that I did off of the dimensions I had, and obviously there was some rounding. What you guys usually see on the internet is the 10%. I'll put the calculations for that up as well, just so you guys can easily see that option. And of course, if you have questions in the comments and want help calculating it out, just let me know. I will give a hand. Once you have those ratios set and you know what you're going to do, it's time to hit the stove. When making gel blocks, I typically use distilled water to make sure that you have as minimal impurities within the gel as possible. Of course, you don't have to do this, but it will help with the clarity of your block and reduce any opacity issues, any kind of like help with the color and transparency and all of that. Also, it's like $1 a gallon, so not too big of a deal to deal with. This part isn't necessary, but I do recommend chilling the distilled water or whatever water you're going to use ahead of time. Keep it in the fridge for a few hours and let it get a bit cooler. It will kind of help bloom the gelatin when you mix it, but if you're a little more rushed, less patient, don't have the space to do this, you can just go right ahead and pour it in at room temperature, whatever temperature you have it at. Not hot yet though. I was able to find this gelatin off of Amazon, thankfully, and you can see here that it is pig fat, which is what is typically used for ballistic gel. And it is also 250 bloom. I'll get into more detail on this when I have the other video of different types of gel and assessment. But for the sake of this video, that was ideally what I was looking for. Can wind up being a little expensive if that's what you're buying. I was lucky to find this on Amazon, actually pretty cheap, especially for the quantity that I was looking for. But I have seen plenty of people do this at home with just the Knox gelatin packets. It'll get the job done. One of the key things to keep in mind when doing this is you're not going to get it perfect compared to what I maybe do at work and what, you know, the professionals like the guys at Ballistic Dummy Labs are doing. And that's okay. Your kitchen is not the best environment to be doing this. But what is important is that you're consistent with yourself. So if you were using the same gelatin amongst all of your blocks and you're heating it the same way, you're shooting it at the same temperatures and kind of calibrated the same, then it's okay if it's not exactly 20% or 10%. It's okay if, you know, you messed up the mixture a little bit, because what you're looking for is to be able to take those blocks and compare it to each other. If I have 3 blocks that are slightly wrong, but all 3 are consistent, you can still wind up having a pretty useful assessment on what rounds you were firing into them. But we're gonna try to get as close as we can at home here. When doing a 20% gel block, since there is so much gelatin compared to the water, you're gonna quickly notice that it winds up becoming like mashed potato mixture. Yeah, don't eat it. It is not as good as mashed potatoes are, I promise. But because it is a much denser combination, it's important to bloom your gelatin. So what I wind up doing and would recommend you guys do, especially for 20%, this is less necessary for 10, but still recommended to help make sure you have an even mixture. Slowly pour your gelatin into your distilled water. You can see here that the containers I'm using aren't exactly a great size for doing this. I would recommend bigger containers if you could, or at least wider ones to help make a more even mixing environment. But slowly pour some distilled water in, sprinkle some of that gelatin in and mix it in as you go until you're completely out of gelatin and water. And let it sit for a few hours. I did about 2. If you go over, it's not a big deal. If you go under, also not too big of a deal, but what you're looking for is to make sure that the water is absorbed by the gelatin and that everything is kind of dissolved. It's not gonna look dissolved at this point because it's a disgusting mesh, but you wanna make sure that the water is absorbed and that each part of the gelatin has at least been exposed to water. I'd say get your hands in there, but that kind of defeats the purpose of clarity. I'd be lying if I said I didn't shove my arms in to hand mix this. It's a mess. Fair warning. Once that looks mixed up and you've let it soak for a few hours, it is time to bring that gel to temperature. This part here might be a little bit annoying because you do want to make sure that you keep an eye on the gel at all times. It is very easy to boil the gelatin, and that's not really something that you want to do. It will ruin the gelatin. You'll kind of wind up denaturing the gelatin proteins, collagen proteins, and it's not gonna set properly. You're not gonna get the right consistency for your gel block. So low and slow, be patient, especially if you're using a taller container like I did for this, where the bottom is going to wind up heating much more than the top. You want to take that extra time to make sure you're mixing, heating it slowly, and keeping everything as even temperatured as you can. I did wind up having to split this into 2 containers because I realized it was too much of a mess. Kind of a problem with doing this is you're, in theory, splitting up the ratio, and you might not have a perfect mix at this point, but we're gonna get both to the same temperature, both mix evenly, and when we put it back in the mold, you can always give it a quick little mix just to make sure that it is a homogeneous mixture at that point and that there weren't any variations between one pot to the other. But the most important part is making sure that they stay within the same temperatures. For a heating gel, you want to keep it around that 105-degree Fahrenheit mark. I did put a thermometer in here so I could monitor towards the top of the block, mixing continuously to make sure that the temperature distribution was even. It's okay if it goes past this, but you don't want to allow your gelatin to boil at all, and you don't ideally want to get it past 120 degrees. So I set my thermometer to beep at me when it hit 105. This way I had an idea of where it was at, but of course, time to mix thoroughly, time to take it off the temperature and pour between the two containers. There's wiggle room. I expected this to be an absolute mess pouring, so I put tarps down just to be sure. I put my mold on a baking tray to catch anything just in case. And then time to pour. Thankfully, I had help with this one. Of course, if you can get a hand with someone, it's going to be a lot easier. Important to try and pour as slowly as you reasonably can when doing this. A fast pour is going to wind up introducing air, and you can wind up getting air bubbles within the mixture. You can see here that the top of this block is a little kind of scummy, that there's a lot of foam at the top. And you can also see that there's this big old chunk of gunk that I took out. In a perfect world, you can pour this over a strainer to help catch those things. The foam is just a result of how it was heated and mixed. The gunk, on the other hand, was a result of some gel sitting at the corner, bottom of the container, and not being mixed properly. Don't let that go in, keep that out. That's obviously not a good thing to include. Not the end of the world. If you can't strain it, the foam will sit at the top and the rest of the block will have good clarity. You can do what I did and just kind of take a spoon and skim it off the top as you are done pouring. And you can also see here that once the block was kind of settled, we took some extra duct tape just to make sure that the cardboard didn't bulge out, and it helped retain that even shape. It did try bowing. That's a lot of weight in there. They're like 20-pound blocks. So whatever extra support you can provide to the cardboard, the better. And now for the worst part of doing this. No, the mess in your kitchen was not the worst part. The terrible stench of pig fat, also not bad. Having to clear the beer out of your fridge is the worst part. Yeah, it's gonna take up a lot of space. I could fit comfortably 2 blocks in my fridge, but realistically, I didn't wanna move more than that. And then you're gonna have to wait probably about 8+ hours before you're able to use these. So when preparing gel for testing, expect to use it probably the following day after it's made. Let it sit overnight. It can sit in your fridge for a bit. You want to make sure that it's obviously kept cold, but I wouldn't recommend letting it sit in there for maybe more than a week or 2 max. You will start to see life being created on the outside of the gel blocks. But once that's all set and ready, you are good for testing. For a proper calibrated test, you do want to ideally shoot a BB through your gel block. Little airsoft BB like the 4.5mm ones, kind of pop it off on one end of the block, probably closer towards the corner is what we usually do, firing at about a distance of 15 feet. And that BB should go through at about 3 to 4 inches. If it's hitting that mark in the block, then you know you are calibrated properly and you are good to go. If it's not quite at that point, your block might not be at temperature. It's very common when doing this that you take the block out, you drive to your testing location, and it warms up and suddenly your block is not cold enough to be tested, or conversely, your block is too cold, too fresh out of the fridge, and needs time to settle. So when making gel, you wanna make sure that you can keep it at temperature up until the point of firing. Like I said, I do wanna do a video on how to properly assess these, so keep your eyes out for that one in the very near future. But this is the quick and dirty of how you can make ballistic gel at home. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to see you on the next video. Bye. Okay.